You know, we often talk about nation building as if it's strictly the job of politicians. We look at policies, laws, treaties. But I've been thinking lately, isn't the real architecture of a country often drawn up in boardrooms, not parliament?
That is a provocative way to start, but I think you're right. If you look at the fabric of daily life, where we go when we're sick, how we connect with the world, what we buy, that's not policy, that's enterprise.
Exactly. And that brings us to the figure we're dissecting today, Ashok Pathirage. Now, on paper, he's a businessman, chairman of SoftLogic, former chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines. But looking at the trajectory, businessman feels like too small a word.
It does. It feels inadequate because his story isn't really about the accumulation of wealth. I mean, sure, that's a byproduct, but if you look at the timeline, his career reads more like a blueprint for modernizing a nation. It's about belief.
Belief is a strong word for the corporate world. Usually, it's about margins.
In his case, they are the same thing. Think about where he started. We're talking about a young man in Sri Lanka, looking at the rest of the world, seeing technology explode, healthcare advancing, retail shifting, and asking a very dangerous question: why not us?
Dangerous because it implies the current state isn't good enough.
Precisely. It's a disruption of the status quo. That's the seed of SoftLogic. It wasn't just let's start a company. It was let's bridge the gap between where Sri Lanka is and where the world is going.
And that gap was wide back then.
Massive. And that's where the visionary builder persona comes in. He didn't just dip his toe in. He built an ecosystem. You have healthcare, retail, technology, leisure, finance. Most people specialize. They pick a lane. He paved the whole highway.
It's interesting you mention that, because usually diversification is a risk mitigation strategy. You know, don't put all your eggs in one basket. But with him, it feels different. It feels like access?
That is the perfect word. Access. He imagined a Sri Lanka where a regular family could walk into a hospital and get world-class care, or buy global brands right at home. He democratized the modern lifestyle.
So, SoftLogic wasn't just a conglomerate. It was a mechanism for social mobility.
In a way, yes. It normalized a standard of living that was previously out of reach. And that takes patience. You don't build an empire like that overnight. It requires seeing a future that no one else sees and having the stomach to wait for it.
Speaking of having the stomach for things, we have to pivot to the second chapter of this story. Because if SoftLogic was the dream, Sri Lankan Airlines was the nightmare.
A nightmare is putting it mildly. It was more like walking into a burning building while an earthquake is happening.
Let's set the scene. 2019. He takes over the chairmanship of the national carrier.
Right. And remember the context. The airline is already bleeding. We are talking losses exceeding $800 million. The debt is mounting. And then, just as he grabs the wheel, the world stops.
COVID-19.
The pandemic. 2020. Fleets grounded worldwide. Borders closed. Revenue drops to effectively zero overnight. And if that wasn't enough, Sri Lanka as a country plunges into its worst economic crisis in history.
It sounds impossible. I mean, legacy carriers with deep pockets in Europe and America were collapsing or begging for bailouts. Sri Lankan Airlines didn't have deep pockets. It had debt.
Exactly. And this is where the story shifts from business success to crisis leadership. Most people would have walked away. Or they would have just let it crash. But Pathirage treated the airline not as a business to be liquidated, but as a lifeline to be protected.
What does that mean in practice, though? A lifeline?
It means understanding that an island nation cannot lose its wings. He realized that if they lost their global slots, their presence in international airports, they would never get them back. So, survival became the strategy. Not profit, survival.
That's a hard sell to stakeholders, isn't it? Hey, we aren't going to make money. We're just going to try to exist.
It's an incredibly hard sell, but look at what he did. He kept essential routes open. He kept cargo moving. When the country was running out of medicine and essentials, those planes were the bridge. And then, consider the fuel crisis.
Oh right, the fuel shortages.
There were days when they literally couldn't procure jet fuel in Colombo. He had to navigate a sovereign default, soaring oil prices, and a complete lack of foreign exchange.
How do you even manage that?
You bring in private sector discipline. That's the key. He rationalized costs brutally but intelligently. He renegotiated with suppliers. He stopped the bleeding where he could, but, and this is crucial, he refused to gut the airline to the point of no return.
He didn't sell off the furniture to pay the rent.
Exactly. He resisted reckless fleet reductions. He knew that if they shrank too much, they'd never be able to compete when the market came back. It was a high-wire act.
It's fascinating because he was essentially a buffer between the airline and the chaos of the state.
That's the human leader aspect. He used his personal credibility, his reputation from the private sector, to facilitate dialogue between the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and the international lessors. When the country defaulted in 2022, nobody wanted to touch Sri Lanka, but they would talk to him.
So his personal brand actually saved the national brand.
Without a doubt. He secured emergency liquidity when the coffers were empty. By the time he left in 2024, the airline hadn't returned to profit, no. But it was alive. Passenger numbers were up, cargo was strong, and investors were interested.
In that context, survival is a massive victory.
It's the only victory that matters. History is littered with airlines that vanished during that period. Sri Lankan is still flying. That is the legacy.
It makes you think about the definition of success. We usually measure it in quarterly earnings. But here, the metric is resilience.
And that's the deeper philosophical lesson here. Ashok Pathirage's story teaches us that true leadership isn't about steering the ship in calm waters. Anyone can do that. It's about holding the wheel when the storm is tearing the sails apart.
And doing it for a purpose bigger than yourself. You know, we talked about access earlier with soft logic. With the airline, it was connectivity. It seems the thread tying his life together is keeping doors open for the country.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Whether it's a hospital door, a retail door, or an aircraft door, he ensured Sri Lanka remained open to the world.
It's also a story about the loneliness of leadership, I imagine. The text mentions sleepless nights.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the weight. You are responsible for thousands of employees, a national icon, and you are fighting forces, like a global pandemic, that are completely out of your control. That requires a level of faith that goes beyond business school logic.
Faith in what?
Faith in the future. Faith that the storm will end. And faith that if you just keep the structure standing, the sun will eventually rise.
And it did.
It did.
So, looking at Ashok Pathirage now, what do we take away for the young entrepreneur listening to this, or even just someone trying to navigate their own career?
I think the takeaway is that vision must outlive adversity. You will face setbacks, you might face a global crisis. But if your purpose is clear, if you know why you are building what you are building, you can endure almost anything.
And perhaps that legacy isn't about the wealth you leave behind.
No. It's about what continues after you leave the room. The systems, the institutions, the possibilities. Soft logic continues. Sri Lankan Airlines continues. That is the testament.
It's a powerful reminder. We often look for heroes in capes, but sometimes they are just people who refuse to give up on a vision.
And who have the courage to say, why not us?
Why not us? I love that. It's a challenge to all of us, really. To stop waiting for permission to build something great.
Absolutely. The landscape is there for the taking, for anyone brave enough to reimagine it.
Well, on that inspiring note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the life and impact of Ashok Pathirage, a builder, a defender, and a visionary.
A story that definitely proves that one person's belief can shift the direction of a nation.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. To our listeners, take a moment today to look around at the structures in your life, the businesses, the services, and think about the vision it took to put them there.
And maybe ask yourself what you're building next.
Until next time, keep dreaming, keep building.
Goodbye, everyone.
You know, we often